Maize production begins long before the first seed enters the soil. Beneath every successful crop is a series of decisions about soil, water, genetics, machinery, nutrition, pests, diseases, and ultimately the market. Use an example of an hypothetical farm. Let's say Motlele Farm. At Motlele Farm, a 100-hectare block of yellow maize provides an opportunity to follow these decisions through an entire production season, from the preparation of the land to the movement of the harvested grain into the market. The process begins with the soil, but even before the soil is assessed, the field has to be prepared. Cultivation prepares the physical environment in which the maize will establish its roots. Assume the farm. Assume the farm where conventional tillage forms part of the production system. Beginning with the management of weeds and residue from the previous crop, a compact disc harrow works the soil approximately 200 millimeters, helping incorporate and break down residues while controlling weeds that could otherwise compete with the emerging maize crop. Crop residues can also provide a source of inoculum for certain diseases and shelter for pests, making residue management relevant not only to seedbed preparation but also to crop health. The next operation is reaping, to approximately 450 millimeters. Rather than simply disturbing the entire soil profile, reaping is also intended to address compacted layers that may have developed through machinery traffic or previous livestock activity from the previous season, or machinery that was working the land. Compaction can restrict root penetration, reduce infiltration, and limit the movement of water and air through the soil. The compact disc harrow then returns to the field, refining the seedbed and creating a more suitable surface for planting. The objective is not simply to make the field look cultivated. A good seedbed needs to provide the planter with a consistent environment where the seed can be placed at a correct depth and spacing. Planting decisions are therefore influenced by more than machinery. Soil moisture, weather conditions, labor availability, machine capacity, input costs, and the available planting window all determine when the field is ready. On a 100-hectare block, machinery efficiency also becomes important. A multi-row maize planter allows a large area to be planted within the available window while maintaining consistent row spacing and seed placement. But before the planter enters the field, there is another question that needs to be answered. What exactly is the soil giving the crop? Soil is more than the medium holding the maize plant upright. It is the environment that supplies the water, nutrients, and physical support while providing a habitat for the biological processes that drive nutrient cycling. Understanding this begins with a soil assessment. In summer crop production, some of the preparation undertaken before planting is commonly referred to as winter work. The objective is to identify limitations before they become production problems during the growing season. The physical side of the soil assessment considers characteristics such as texture, structure, organic matter, drainage of the soil, infiltration, and compaction. And the chemical side looks at the pH, the nutrient availability, the cation exchange capacity, and the base saturation. while the biological side considers microbial activity such as decomposition and nutrient cycling, all three intact. A soil may contain adequate nutrients, but if compaction restricts root growth, the crop may struggle to access them. Similarly, a soil may have a good structure but poor chemical fertility, limiting production despite having favorable physical conditions. For maize, deep, well-drained soils with loamy texture are generally favorable or ideal because they provide a balance between drainage, root development, and water retention. But it's not meaning that maize is limited to soil with loamy texture. And the pH in the region of about 5.8 to 7 is generally suitable, with adequate organic matter and the absence of severe compaction. All those can help create a more favorable root environment for the crop. This is where the soil at the farm becomes particularly important. Assume the production block at the farm is predominantly a sandy loam soil. Sandy loam contains a relatively high proportion of soil together with smaller fractions of silt and clay. This gives the soil relatively good drainage while still retaining enough water and nutrients to support the crop growth. The soil depth varies across production areas. Assume it is ranging from approximately 70 centimeters to 1 meter, while the predominant soil form is Hutton. But the texture and depth only tell part of the story. The soil test provides a much more detailed picture. Let's assume that the measured pH is approximately 5.6, indicating an acidic soil conditions. The pH of the soil affects the nutrient uptake. So no matter how much fertilizer is applied, if the soil pH is not fixed to the optimal range, it is technically losing when fertilizing. For maize production, that acidity becomes an important consideration because soil pH influences nutrient availability and the overall chemical environment around the roots. This is why a soil test is not simply a collection of numbers. It becomes the starting point for the management program. For a detailed soil test, where rigorous methods have been used, relevant advisors must first be consulted instead of doing the DIY. Assume an advisor is consulted and the soil test at the farm identifies several areas that require attention. The first is acidity. With a soil pH of approximately 5.6, assume the recommendation is to apply around 1.3 tons of dolomitic lime per hectare. Across the 100 hectare block, that becomes 130 tons of dolomitic lime. That is a substantial quantity of material, and it immediately demonstrates why soil correction needs to be planned before planting, rather than treated as an afterthought. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is another important factor. For this example of the soil test, the carbon to nitrogen ratio is approximately 1:36, compared to the target of around 1:20 to 1:25. This tells us that there is relatively more carbon in the soil system compared with nitrogen. Carbon is the energy source for microorganisms, while nitrogen is needed for their growth and for their nutrient cycling. When the ratio is wider, this can temporarily use up the available nitrogen, making less of it available to the crop. So this is where the residue management and crop rotation become important. not as a quick fix, but as a part of building a better functioning soil system over time. Rather than continually removing crop residues from the field, retaining organic material and introducing a crop such as soybean into the rotation can contribute to nutrient cycling and microbial activity, balancing the carbon to nitrogen ratio. The objective is not to simply add more material to the soil, but to build a functioning soil system over time. Another chemical consideration is the cation exchange capacity, or the CEC. The CEC describes the soil's capacity to retain and exchange positively charged nutrients, including calcium, magnesium, potassium, and ammonium, which is another form of nitrogen. Humic substances are therefore considered as a component of a longer-term soil building program. The numbers do not exist independently. The soil pH, the CEC, the base saturation, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio all describe different parts of the same production environment. This is where variable rate soil sampling becomes valuable. And I know some people might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't that more expensive? It can be, but the potential savings from avoiding unnecessary fertilizer application across the field can outweigh that extra sampling cost. Our hypothetical farm is 100 hectares, so you can't treat it as the same all across the different blocks. Why? Because it is different. It is most likely to be different. Does not have the same characteristics, and it has to be broken in smaller chunks because itself is a larger chunk. You can't just average the characteristics and applications of practices. So breaking it down into smaller blocks of testing the soil will help identify the different areas that need to be addressed or apply different rates of fertilizer. So 100 hectare field is not necessarily one uniform block of soil. Different areas can contain different nutrient concentrations, pH values, and physical characteristics. So sampling these areas separately allows fertilizer recommendations to become more precise rather than treating every part of the field as identical. Think about our lime application. So soil pH is measured on a logarithmic scale. For example, a pH of 4 is 100 times more acidic than a pH of 6. Let me say that again. A pH of 4 is 100 times more acidic than a pH of 6. Compare that to a pH of 5 being 10 times more acidic than a pH of 6. So for every point increase, the shift is dramatic. We might have one part of the field, for example in our hypothetical farm, at 5.6, where raising it to 5.8 requires, for example, 1.3 tons of lime per hectare. But another part might already be at 5.8. And if that were to be raised at the same 0.2 points to 6, it could require considerably more lime because the soil does not respond in a perfectly linear way. It's the same 0.2 point increase, but the lime requirement can be very different. So yes, detailed soil sampling costs more upfront, but if it prevents us from applying tons of lime or fertilizer where they aren't needed, that cost can potentially pay for itself. That's the advantage of moving away from a blanket application and managing the field according to what the soil actually needs. The soil test therefore becomes the foundation for the fertilizer program that follows, or preparing the seedbed, where you will have to make certain corrections based on variable applications. That's why winter work is crucial. The field approaches the planting window having fixed any limitations with corrections to the soil's fertility.